Hello, this is Bilge Yesil. In this presentation, I examine the mediation of Muslim victimhood and its articulation with populist tropes through an analysis of content produced by TRT World, Turkey's first international news channel launched by the AKP government. My point of departure is the existing research on the nexus of populism and religion, which has mostly focused on right-wing politicians and their Islamophobic discourse in contemporary Europe and the US. To contribute to this literature, I examined the populist mobilization of Muslim identity by a non-Western actor, the AKP, and account for sociocultural and historical dynamics of the ideational framework that animates its Islamic populist communication. There's a handful of analyses on the instrumentalization of Islam in the Middle East and North Africa by populist parties and politicians. In these studies, Islamic populism is generally conceptualized as a response to political economic transformations spurred by the rise of global capitalism and the end of the Cold War. These studies, although rooted in political economy paradigm, nonetheless make some references to religio-cultural dimensions, such as populist politicians in Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey making appeals to Islamic faith and morals, invoking the Ummah, or Islamic populist parties in North Africa opposing Western culture or modernization. These studies provide useful insights into different manifestations of Islamic populism, yet they remain exclusively concerned with political economic dynamics in the domestic context of the country under examination. To remedy this gap, I examined the AKP's populism as one that instrumentalizes Muslim identity politics on an international scale and as part of its efforts to further its geopolitical economic agenda. I trace these contemporary materializations of Islamic populism through the AKP's global outreach. Turkey's existing regional and international communication apparatus expanded considerably in the 2000s when the AKP government began to pursue a more assertive foreign policy in the Middle East and the Balkans, with the hopes of restoring the erstwhile Ottoman glory and influence in these regions. Especially since the 2010s, the AKP broadened the scope of this outreach to mitigate the criticism it has received in Western news media and at the same time to promote Turkey as a rising great power in world politics. The AKP's foreign policy vision positions Turkey as a self-proclaimed political center in the Middle East and beyond. To become a global power, Turkey takes stock of its Muslim identity and Ottoman legacy and creates a hinterland in the Balkans, Caucasus, Middle East, and beyond. This foreign policy vision shapes various aid, development, cultural exchange, and humanitarian assistance programs. To publicize these activities, such as humanitarian assistance, global aid and development, and humanitarian aid that is, especially delivered to predominantly Muslim countries around the world, and to promote Turkey as a rising great power, the AKP deploys a number of international media and communication outlets. Among the most prominent state-run outlets are international television channels such as TRT World, TRT Kurdish, TRT Arabic, TRT German, which is in beta phase, digital news sites, TRT Russian, TRT Swahili, International Radio Network, Voice of Turkey, that broadcasts in more than 30 languages, and the state-run news agency, ANADOLU agency, which operates offices around the world and provides wire service in more than a dozen languages. Other than these state-sponsored media, commercial news outlets owned by loyalist media tycoons, such as English-language newspapers Daily Sabah and Yeni Şafak English, and a 24/7 English-language online news channel, A News, contribute to the AKP's global communication agenda. There are also websites, social media accounts, and social media campaigns run by Bosphorus Global, which is a communication and PR entity, and SETA, which is an international think tank. Both Bosphorus Global and SETA are funded by Erdogan's network of family and business connections. Despite the differences in terms of their political economic structures, content, and style, both state-run and commercial media and communication entities all seek to frame Turkey as a global power that can challenge Western hegemony in international affairs and achieve pan-Islamic unity and justice for Muslims. To this end, they use a counter-hegemonic discourse, calling out the West for its past and present, real and perceived exploitation of predominantly Muslim countries in the global South, and they also call out the West for its racist and Islamophobic currents. Among these initiatives, TRT World is the most prominent and professionalized organization. It is solely subsidized by the state purse and remains under the financial control of the AKP. It is also fully aligned with the party's political agenda. It therefore presents valuable insights into the particular narratives that the AKP seeks to disseminate to international audiences. It was launched in 2015 and it is headquartered in Istanbul with studios in London and Washington, D.C. According to its website, it reaches 260 million people in 190 countries. It's available on various European and US cable operators, pay TV providers, and is carried by 11 satellite operators. It has partnerships with hotel chains in 31 countries. Similar to its counterparts in international news landscape, TRT World covers politics, business, sports, arts, and culture through a mixture of news bulletins, debate programs, and documentaries. Its live and recorded news bulletins incorporate in-studio and on-the-ground reporting from around the world with Western and non-Western presenters and reporters. Yet its editorial line is premised on the empowerment of non-Western voices and the presentation of an alternative perspective to Western news organizations. TRT World emphasizes that it brings, quote-unquote, a humanitarian perspective to international news by foregrounding the voices and the stories of the downtrodden people and the forgotten ones. The 8 documentaries I analyzed for the purposes of this article offer a highly personalized and emotional account of Muslim victimhood and or Islamophobia. Among them are 2 productions that are specifically concerned with Western contexts. Muslims in Britain, Unheard Voices, reveals the extent to which British Muslims from all walks of life are faced with anti-Muslim sentiments on a daily basis. Meanwhile, Another America, the First Muslims in America, is concerned with the intersection of religious and social justices in the US. There are documentaries that tackle military and or police violence against Muslims with emphasis on emotional and physical suffering and Muslims yearning for justice. The Face of Hate, anti-Muslim violence in Sri Lanka examines Buddhist hardliner monks' attacks against Muslims. Unwanted, the Rohingya Exodus, foregrounds the voices of Rohingya refugees that fled Myanmar military. Kashmir, Fault Lines in the Valley, offers a look at the physical and emotional cost of the conflict between Hindu nationalists and Muslims. TRT World documentaries also keep fresh the memory of past atrocities that were committed against Muslims, such as Black Orchards, that revisits the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and Justice and Genocide, that examines the work of the International Criminal Tribunal and the suffering of Bosnian Muslims and their search for justice. Last but not least, Beaten by the Border highlights the Croatian border guards' violent attacks against migrants. It does not explicitly focus on migrants' Muslim identity, but nonetheless constructs a binary opposition between Europe and others that happen to be from predominantly Muslim countries such as Iran and Iraq. It is imperative to analyze these documentaries not only in terms of what they communicate, but also how they communicate it. While one can hardly critique TRT World documentaries for drawing attention to Muslim victimhood, it is their ahistorical and moralistic approach that should beckon our attention. TRT World documentaries establish binary oppositions such as the oppressed versus the oppressor, peace versus violence, compassion versus inhumanity, justice versus injustice, and frame Islamophobia as a battle between good and evil. They offer a cursory description of the problem at hand while completely ignoring the historical and structural conditions that have produced it. For example, they tell us how many Muslims the Buddhists killed, injured, or displaced, but fail to acknowledge the post-colonial histories and socioeconomic dynamics that fuel Islamophobia in Asia. They bring up the racialization of Muslims and critique the downfall of European values. Yet they do not mention how right-wing nationalist politicians and sensationalist mass media exploit nativist and anti-immigration views in Europe, or how the sociocultural production of fear after September 11 has created moral panics about Islam in Europe and the US. Aside from these documentaries, TRT World reports on Muslim suffering through online news videos and social media campaigns. In online news videos, TRT World presents factual information about Muslim victimhood, especially Islamophobia. Usually 2 to 4 minutes in length, these videos cover anti-Muslim rhetoric in everyday life, politics and education, physical and verbal attacks against Muslims, vandalism and arson against mosques and schools, and the general rise of Islamophobia around the world. TRT World directs attention to Muslim victimhood through TRT World Citizen as well. that is the channel's social responsibility arm. This entity hosts events, organizes annual signature campaigns, and creates social media content to raise awareness about the suffering of Muslims, either in their own countries or in others where they seek refuge. These campaigns focus on the sexual exploitation and trafficking of refugee children in Europe, the suffering of women in Syria, Myanmar, Bosnia, Kashmir, and South Sudan, Christchurch attacks in New Zealand, and the human rights abuses faced by Afghan, Syrian, Rohingya, and Kashmiri Muslim refugees in Europe. To understand the assertion of Muslim victimhood in and through TRT World content, it's imperative to contextualize it in relation to the AKP's Islamist logic and religiously inflected populism. The AKP has designated Muslims as being under threat from others and ascribed itself the role of their leader and protector. This discourse on Muslim victimhood is not necessarily novel or exclusive to the AKP, and it has been the main ideological and discursive tenet of nationalist Islamist worldview since at least the turn of the 20th century. It has also been deployed by various right-wing nationalist conservative parties and movements in contemporary Turkish politics. The narrative of undeserved suffering in nationalist Islamist politics can be traced back to the religious mythology of Islam, which is laced with parables of oppression and injustice. Islamist politicians in Turkey fused the suffering of Muhammad and the first Muslims with the hardships that emanated from the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the Caliphate, and the marginalization of pious Muslims during the modern Turkish Republic's westernization program. This historical narrative of victimhood, which is interwoven with concepts of loss, injustice, and persecution, helps us to understand the source of the AKP's Islamic populist politics. TRT World content on Muslim suffering is therefore not accidental, but in fact symptomatic of the AKP's ideational framework. The assertion of victimhood constitutes one of the core elements of the Muslim identity that the AKP embraces and promotes. At the domestic level, the AKP deploys victimhood to mobilize its base against threats such as, quote, Western forces, Jews, Masonic networks, and their internal collaborators, end quote. At the international level, victimhood-related binaries, such as oppressed versus oppressor, compassion versus violence, good versus evil, as evinced in TRT World documentaries, are part and parcel of the AKP's Islamic solidarity politics. TRT World documentaries constitute only one of the sites where the AKP's populist mobilization of Muslim identity can be traced. There are indeed other state-run and commercial outlets that seek to inform international audiences about Muslim suffering and shape public opinion in favor of Muslims and the Erdogan government, the self-described benevolent guardian of Muslims. These communicative practices reduce complex social political phenomena to questions of good versus bad, moral versus immoral, and hide the AKP's geopolitical agenda behind a so-called post-colonial critique. The knowledges and images of Muslim subjects that the AKP-sponsored outlets disseminate ultimately essentialize Muslim identity and subalternity into a saga of oppression, to use Mohanty's term, and they harden the clash of civilizations thesis that they nominally seek to criticize. Thank you.